BOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Knidheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. On Mondays, I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. And in this episode, I will be responding to the new Zodiac Killer show called The Chronicle, discussing the book Zodiac Killer in the Shadow of Madness by Professor Heinrich Mueller, and our Zodiac Monday movie of the week will be He Walked by Night. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Firstly, I would like to give a big shout out to Cheryl, Druser, and everybody associated with the new Zodiac program, The Chronicle, which will be a monthly Zodiac panel discussion show that is available on the channel Zodiac Theory. Now, I've been talking about this one for a while because they were supposed to put out the new episode on September 21st, but there was a delay for some reasons, so they released the first episode of the new panel show on September 28th. And their first piece of subject material was discussing the mind of the killer, which is something that I find to be fascinating. They also had Mike Rodelli on the program, author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo, and he was talking a lot about his Zodiac Killer suspect, Shel Cavalli. And as far as the way the new show is structured, it begins with a panel discussion, then they jump to an interview, then they have a panel response. It's very well produced, very interactive, and it has a lot of different components and a lot of different edits that have been put into it. So once again, big credit to everybody associated with the new show, The Chronicle, available on Zodiac Theory. And if you haven't subscribed yet to that new channel, I invite you to do so. But they issued a challenge question to the listeners, and you guys who follow Zodiac Monday and the other programs here on Black Box Online Radio will know that I cannot resist challenge questions. So here it is. What was the Zodiac's primary psychological driver? Okay, so why did the Zodiac do what he did? The Zodiac created a very short reign of terror, starting on December 20th of 1968 with the Lake Herman Road murders, and going to October 11th of 1969 with the murder of Paul Stine. The Zodiac also mailed numerous letters, cards, and ciphers, bomb diagrams, and the Zodiac was way more prolific when it came to writing letters as opposed to being a serial killer. But these are their options. This is actually multiple choice. And what was the Zodiac's primary psychological driver? The choices are social power. The crimes were a compensation for a life of personal and professional failure, making him feel important and in control. Okay, that's one. The next one, intellectual superiority. The murders were a means to an end. His real goal was proving that he was smarter than the police and the public through ciphers and games. Okay, intellectual superiority is number 2. Then sadistic gratification. The letters and games were secondary. His core motivation was the direct personal pleasure derived from stalking, terrorizing, and murdering his victims. And number 4 is public performance. His ultimate goal was to create a lasting and terrifying myth. The victims' letters and ciphers were all just props for his public spectacle, and there is even an option for none of the above or other. And I think that the people that would choose none of the above or other are those who are entertaining some hypothesis that the CIA was behind all of this, or that it's like a drug-related angle, or it's some type of government conspiracy and cover-up. That might be the choice if you want to put it there. But my simple, honest answer to this is, you guys know what I'm going to say. Those of you who have followed Black Box Online Radio and Zodiac Monday, you know exactly what I'm going to say. It's all of the above, right? I mean, the Zodiac did all of these things: social power, intellectual superiority, sadistic gratification, and public performance. But I know that that's not a very satisfying answer, and I also know that you would want a specific choice. So if I had to choose just one of these, because the challenge question is, what is the primary driving factor for the Zodiac Killer, the primary psychological driver? Absolutely social power. That's the one I'm going with. The crimes were a compensation for a life of personal and professional failure, making him feel important and in control. And the reason why I say this is, in 2019, I had a major shift with the channel when I began stepping down just from talking only about unsolved mysteries and saying, okay, here's what I think happened, and just watching 5 or 6 YouTube videos thinking I had solved a case and providing my theory to an unsolved mystery. I learned way too late in the game that that's an impractical approach, and this channel really focused more on things like the Zodiac Killer, on a case like the Zodiac Killer mystery, because I realized that I actually had to try much harder to understand a true crime case and an unsolved mystery, and I also began focusing more on criminal psychology. And since 2019, when I began looking at the information differently, I re-examined the age-old saying, why do people commit crimes? Money, sex, and power. The trinity of true crime deviants. And which one is the most powerful guiding force? I gave it away already. It's powerful. It's power. Power is the reason why a lot of people commit crimes. And you can see this so clearly when you look at different true crime cases, because you can see how somebody is trying to commit a crime, but really, it's not only for money, or it's not only for sex, or it's not only for murdering a business partner to get control of the business because they want to use the business for things. Well, what's the commonality with all of these things? Power. And even when you talk about sex-related crimes, some people say that it's not about sex at all. It's about power. This is one of the absolute strongest factors that drives all criminals to operate. Some people are desperate and they do commit crimes for money. Yes, that can definitely happen. But with somebody like the Zodiac Killer, absolutely he could have just satisfied his criminal urges in other ways. The fact that he chose to write letters bragging about this, that shows that he wanted power. Now, was it for these specific reasons? Compensation for a life of personal and professional failure? Well, I'm not necessarily convinced that the Zodiac was a failure, but he definitely maybe wanted more than what he had. We can look at it from that perspective. This is another point that was discussed on the new panel discussion show, again, the Chronicle, available on the channel Zodiac Theory, and they were asking the question, was the Zodiac Killer a rich man or a poor man? Was he somewhere in the middle, somewhere in between? And I think Druser, in his own very, very rational sense, which I applaud him for, was just like, I don't think the Zodiac Killer had to worry about the rent. Now, Microdeli has a suspect named Shel Cavalli, and he's also the subject of the book Flirting with the Executioner by Gerald Gregory Doan. And Shel Cavalli may have been the wealthiest Zodiac Killer suspect. He was involved in the import-export business with automobiles. He was the man who brought Volkswagens to the West Coast. And in terms of getting financial status in order, I mean, Shel Cavalli was perhaps the wealthiest Zodiac Killer suspect. And Mike Rodelli was pointing at some psychological markers from the profiler Richard Walter by stating that the Zodiac clearly put an enormous amount of time into composing the ciphers, his letters even, and the bus bomb diagrams and the greeting cards. This is the type of person who most likely wasn't working 5 12-hour shifts a week and then just falling on the couch and collapsing and just out of breath when he gets home, take a shower, go to sleep, wake up again, and do it all over. No, this was probably somebody who had the financial means to support a lifestyle where he had the time and leisure to do this. But when you look at this in contrast from somebody like Druser, this just means that the Zodiac Killer perhaps could pay for his own stuff. I mean, just because somebody can pay their own bills, it doesn't mean that they are extremely wealthy, and it also doesn't mean that they won't have time in the day. This is before Netflix. This is before the internet even. So people would easily have 3 or 4 hours a day when they might not be super occupied, especially if they did not have a family. Now, I'm not saying the Zodiac was unmarried, but it's something to think about. So in regards to this, I want to look at the facts. Let's just look at the facts about the Zodiac Killer's means and capabilities. Fact number 1. The Zodiac used a different firearm at every crime scene. At Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa, and the Stein murder. And definitively, I think we can state, we can state this, the Zodiac owned at least 3 firearms, most likely 4. And I say that because at Lake Herman Road, he had a .22 caliber firearm. At Blue Rock Springs, a 9mm Luger. We aren't completely certain what firearm he carried at Lake Berryessa because he didn't discharge anything, he didn't fire any shots, but Brian Hartnell looked at pictures of the firearm that the killer was holding, and he identified it as a 4D5. So we have .22 9mm Luger 45, and then Paul Stein was shot with a different 9mm, not the one that was used at Blue Rock Springs. Okay, so for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to say that the Zodiac owned multiple firearms. We can even just say it. He owned 4 firearms. He had access to a vehicle to get to the crime scenes. And again, I'm not trying to state anything beyond what we factually know. So this seems like somebody who had a certain amount of resources at his disposal. And this all will, of course, beg the question of, were they actually his resources? Was he driving his own car? Did he drive his mother's car or something like that? I'm just, kind of going in circles at that point. But I'm doing that for a reason, because I'm trying to differentiate between what we know factually versus what is a speculative statement. The facts are, he had access to multiple firearms, he had access to a vehicle, he committed the crimes on nights, evenings, weekends, and holidays. This also seems like somebody who may have had a working life, and he definitely had resources that he could use, so he probably wasn't poor, and he probably didn't have a poor family around him. He probably didn't have 6 or 7 kids and a wife who was mad at him all the time, and he just had absolutely no free time, because again, he had to work 5 12-hour shifts a week. So I don't think we're dealing with a poor Zodiac, and I also have not seen anything to indicate that he was overly wealthy or extremely wealthy, that he was a millionaire. Everything could be explained by somebody who is just middle class, especially, again, if we entertain the speculative statement that maybe he wasn't married, maybe he didn't have kids, then this would be somebody with even more free time who can just put all of his resources into his own operations, and then he can become someone who is just writing letters and ciphers in his free time, and also thinking about the next firearm that he's going to purchase. But I'd absolutely state that the Zodiac also has these different components in his personality, like intellectual superiority. The murders were a means to an end. His real goal was proving that he was smarter than the police. Well, the Zodiac definitely stated that. He definitely stated that he was clever and more smarter than the police officers. He called them pigs and blue meanies. He openly said that he did not think that they would catch him. But did you guys notice this about the Zodiac Killer? The Zodiac stated all that stuff. He doesn't like cops. He doesn't think that they can catch him. I am crack-proof, even saying stuff like that. But at the same time, he's like, oh, but by the way, I'm not going to give you any more information because, that you guys might try to catch me and that would slow down the collecting of slaves in the afterlife. And it seems like he's putting it out there that he is aware that he can be caught if he keeps giving stuff away. So he was very aware that he was making himself vulnerable. And I'm talking about the communications that he wrote in November after the murder of Paul Stein. Well, October, the murder of Paul Stein, and the November, the 340 cipher that came in November of 1969 that says, I now have enough slaves to work for me, whereas everybody else has nothing. And really, after the murder of Paul Stein, what the Zodiac Killer said was that he was no longer going to announce his crimes to the public. He was going to describe them as routine robberies and accidents. This is also somebody who's saying, yeah, I'm smarter than you. You're never going to catch me. Oh, but by the way, I'm not going to give you any information because, I don't want you to be on my trail. So that was pretty much a ruse. What I'm trying to say is, I think he was completely aware that he wasn't actually smarter than the police. But moving on to the next one here, we have sadistic gratification. The letters and games were secondary. His core motivation was the direct, personal pleasure that he derived from stalking, terrorizing, and murdering his victims. I mean, everything that I'm seeing from the Zodiac shows that he enjoyed it. He openly said that it was a thrilling experience. Everything the Zodiac has done has shown that he enjoys the process. He likes creating the Zodiac persona. The early letters are just almost gushing with his enthusiasm for killing people. Now, once his letters go on, he openly states a lot of different emotions, saying that he's actually really sad, he's actually really lonely. But in the early letters, when he's actually committing the murders, he's stating that all of these things are true, that he is experiencing sadistic gratification. And I've said this once and I'll say it again. The Zodiac was a sadist. He was not a torturer, and I think there's a big difference. And public performance, his ultimate goal was to create a lasting and terrifying myth. Yes, I don't believe the Zodiac directly wanted to get caught. Maybe there was at some point when he had that experience, but overall, I don't think the Zodiac wanted to get caught. I think he wanted to create the lasting myth of terror, and the Zodiac did terrorize the San Francisco Bay Area. So, my answer is all of the above, but if I had to choose just one, I would say social power. It's the most powerful. But what do you think about this list here? And if you have a different one, if you're in the none of the above or other category, please let me know down below. Those are the people, as I said, who would think that it's CIA related or drug related. But I want to talk about something different right now, here on the Zodiac Killer News Report, and this is going to relate to one of the panelists on there, Mike Rodelli, because Mike Rodelli has a Zodiac Killer suspect who was examined on national television, and when I first became somewhat familiar with the components of the Zodiac Killer case and Mike Rodelli's material, one of the things that you'll experience early on is that people are saying, all right, Mike Rodelli has done this for years. He is a very well-respected researcher. But the biggest problem with Mike Rodelli's suspect, Shel Cavalli, is that he was eliminated by DNA evidence. And Mike Rodelli, of course, appeared on the Chronicle, and he openly wanted to state that he disputes all of that. He disputes those claims, he disputes the findings, and what happened was in 2002, they did the show Primetime on ABC. Sometimes it's stated as 2020, but this was a different news magazine show called Primetime, which was shortly lived. You can watch it on Tom Voigt's channel, Zodiac Killer Official. And I would actually just like to go to the write-up for the program, because this is a point that I think needs to be reinforced. What source did they use for the DNA? I've heard so many different people talk about this. One show that you might hear on YouTube is going to say that it was the 1974 Exorcist letter. Another one might say that it's the 1978 letter. But ABC News released their press release for the 2002 program, Will DNA Solve the 1969 Zodiac Killings? And they state very clearly that they took their DNA from the November 8th, 1969 stamp. That's the stamp on the envelope, not the envelope itself or the internal contents. But I would like to just have a read right here. To date, the San Francisco Police Department has found only a faint result in DNA testing on the 3 envelopes newly discovered by the Primetime source, but the partial profile found on one of the envelopes was already in the department files. One card sent on November 8th, 1969, does allow investigators to draw some conclusions. I found a partial DNA fingerprint from a male individual who at some time has had contact with the stamp, said Dr. Sidney Holt, a supervisor of the department's DNA lab. Investigators are working on the assumption that the man who licked the stamp was the Zodiac Killer. But now wait a second, this is a DNA fingerprint. So this is going to be when the Zodiac or somebody else touch the outside of the stamp. This is not saliva DNA, and you just heard that there. It's a DNA fingerprint. Holt found 4 out of a possible 9 DNA markers, plus an indicator of gender confirming that the killer was a male. But wait for it, it's not enough to positively identify anyone as the Zodiac, but it is enough to narrow suspicions or perhaps even eliminate suspects. And this is some very flimsy stuff. I repeat, it is not enough to positively identify anyone as the Zodiac. But Mike Rodelli's whole claim is they don't actually know that that's the Zodiac Killer's DNA. And furthermore, I mean, if it's from the outside of the stamp and it's just in the ridges of this fingerprint, you also might be wondering something. Well, Is this fingerprint matching the fingerprints that were found on letters or on Paul Stein's taxi? Do they definitively know that this is the Zodiac Killer's fingerprint? And my simple response is, I don't know. I can read this entire article for you, but it's not going to give you that information. And I've read through this thing many times. And one more time, the name of it is Will DNA Solve the 1969 Zodiac Killings by ABC News. It came out in 2002. It was the write-up for their primetime show. You might see dates like 2006, 2008, 2011, because they've reposted the article in different places. But that's what they said the source was, the November 8th, 1969 stamp. And even though the word saliva was used, it's very clearly not saliva DNA. So that means that Mike Rodelli actually had a leg to stand on when he's like, all right, they're telling me my suspect has been eliminated because of DNA results. Well, was that even the Zodiac Killer's DNA? We don't know. Did this DNA fingerprint match the fingerprints from the Stein cab or on a letter, on a different letter, and we could say that at the very least this seems like it's from the killer, not from anything that has been shared to the public. And I want to ask you something. Based on everything that you've heard here, really, I want to phrase the challenge question like this. If the fingerprint that they used for the DNA matched a fingerprint from a different Zodiac letter, would that be sufficient enough for you to say that it was from the killer? If the fingerprint matched a fingerprint on a different letter, is that enough for you to say that it was the killer? Well, I would love to know your responses. And notice that I said from a different letter, not from Paul Stein's taxi. If they had a fingerprint that was imprinted in blood, and then they have the same fingerprint on the November 8th, 1969 stamp, which had the dripping pen card in it, and that's the card that they're talking about, one containing a card, the dripping pen card. So then I would be like, most likely, we're talking about only on different letters. What do you think? Please put your idea in the comments section down below. Now, there is a Zodiac Killer suspect that has recently come on the radar, and his name is Donald James Nickel. He was brought on the scene by an individual named Blake H., and Blake was one of the panelists on the new program, The Chronicle. I've also interviewed Blake, and he's talked all about Donald James Nickel. He was a former member of SFPD. He had 2 careers, and really, he's working with SFPD, and he also runs a sewing machine shop, doing sewing machine repairs, and maybe sales. And Blake was the featured guest on The Chronicle, and he's going to be doing the tour, more or less, going on different programs, sharing his Zodiac Killer findings, and talking about his new suspect, Donald James Nickel. He will also appear on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, shout out to Jerome over there. And please subscribe to all of these channels once again. But as far as appearing on the panel show, a lot of people were asking, all right, this guy, Donald Nickel, he seems like he could be the Zodiac Killer. He seems like he had a very clear grudge against teenagers and young people. He was outed in a scandal because he performed a weird sex act with teenagers, having them spank each other. He was labeled as the spanking cop. And he is even walking out of a courthouse once hiding his face. But a lot of people were saying, all right, I can see some things in the story, but how tall was he? Now, Blake has not been able to perfectly identify it, but he says 5 feet 10 inches tall. That is the release of the height for Donald Nickel. But what I found to be so much more interesting from the panel show The Chronicle is when Blake was saying one of the finds he found was that it turned out that this suspect, Donald Nickel, had the sewing machine shop on the same street where Donna Lass lived. Donna Lass is a possible victim of the Zodiac Killer who was murdered in 1970, and that was in the Lake Tahoe area. But at the time of the 1969 murders, Donna Lass was working in San Francisco at Letterman General Hospital, and one of Blake's discoveries, as he claims, is that Donna Lass lived on Balboa Street, and about 200 yards away was, Donald James Nickel, working, so he is in a very close proximity to Donna Lass. Is San Francisco just a very small world, or is this actually the activities of the Zodiac Killer? And I really cannot wait to see what Blake is going to find next, and I'm really looking forward to him appearing on other programs, because a lot of you guys are curious as well about Donald James Nickel. Was he indeed the Zodiac Killer? Now, this is talking about some things of substance, and thank you so much for listening to everything that you've heard so far about the Zodiac Killer and the new panel show. But right now, I'm going to play a different clip, and it's from the channel Sambucha, which is going to be talking about a possible deathbed confession of the Zodiac. And you're going to have to listen closely, because it's going to come very, very quickly and very briefly. Here's the channel Sambucha.
Here's some of the craziest deathbed confessions. So a Hollywood actor named Margaret Gibson admitted during her last breath that she was responsible for murdering the prolific director William Desmond Taylor, while Henry Lucas, a convicted serial killer, confessed on his deathbed that he lied about everything and didn't actually kill anybody. Christian Sperling confessed that the famous 1934 photo of the Loch Ness Monster was a hoax, and that they constructed a model of the creature to pass it off as real. Earl Van Best confessed to being the Zodiac Killer in his final moments, while Walter Pecka confessed to being D.B. Cooper, one of the most famous criminals in history, who hijacked a plane and extorted a ransom of $200,000 before escaping in a parachute and never being seen again. Joseph Valacchi provided details on the Mafia in his final moments, becoming the first Mafia member to publicly acknowledge the Mafia in the United States. Francis Thompson had one of the most jarring confessions, stating that he killed his entire family 40 years prior. And finally, James Brewer confessed to murder of a man 32 years earlier in his final moments, but he ended up surviving and then was later arrested for his confession. That's crazy.
And one more time, that was from the channel Sambucha. The title of the short was Craziest Deathbed Confessions. Did you hear that nanosecond deathbed confession they shared of Earl Van Best Jr.? Earl Van Best is the subject of the book The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary Stewart and Susan Mustafa, and according to the Sambucha channel, he made a deathbed confession to being the Zodiac Killer. And I think that this is really quite odd because, as I recall from reading that book, Earl Van Best was never even on his deathbed. He got drunk on the streets of Mexico, he got overly intoxicated, he fell on the ground, and he passed away from choking on his own vomit. If I recall correctly, it's been almost 6 years since I've read that book, but that just appears to be absolute nonsense and a pure fabrication. Although I do give him credit, the next suspect that he mentioned, Walter Pecka, is a real D.B. Cooper suspect who did confess to have been D.B. Cooper on tape, mind you, and he's the subject of numerous books, whether it's Better Dead Than Poor, The Search for D.B. Cooper, D.B. Cooper and Me, Getting the Truth. Lots of people have Walter Pecka as a D.B. Cooper suspect. The reason why I'm putting so much emphasis on his last name is his name is Walter Recca, and his name was originally spelled P-E-C-A, but I heard from Darren Schaefer on the Cooper Vortex that was actually pronounced Pika, Walter Pika, then the spelling was changed, and he went by Walter Recca for the rest of his life. He was of East European descent and grew up in a Polish household. He grew up trilingual, reportedly, in English, Polish, and Russian, but Walter Recca also said a bunch of other things, such as him being D.B. Cooper. However, this statement that Francis Thompson, the English poet, confessed to have murdered his whole family, I'm not aware of this. Francis Thompson is a Jack the Ripper suspect. He's the subject of the books Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson by Richard Patterson, as well as Jack the Poet was Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper. And I have episodes about both of these books here on this channel. He's a fascinating Jack the Ripper suspect. He may have actually been Jack the Ripper, but I am absolutely unfamiliar with anything about him confessing to have murdered his whole family. If anything, he seemed like he was estranged from his family for a large portion of his life. So this is not an AI video. As you see, this is a human-generated video. Where are they getting the sources for this stuff about Francis Thompson murdering his family and about Earl Van Best confessing on his deathbed to having been the Zodiac Killer? I'm really not sure. Earl Van Best has mostly been eliminated as a suspect in my book, but I would love to know what you guys think. You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. If you've read The Most Dangerous Animal of All by Gary Stewart, what do you think about Gary Stewart's claim that Earl Van Best was the Zodiac? And if we're going to talk about Zodiac suspects that I haven't mentioned that frequently in the past, many of you will know that I do another segment here on Black Box Online Radio called Dahlia Thursday, where I talk about the Black Dahlia murder. And maybe the most famous Black Dahlia suspect is named George Hodel. And there is a monthly AMA show on the channel Larry Harnish, where he answers questions about the Black Dahlia case. He's followed it for 30 years. And there were so many questions about the Black Dahlia suspect, George Hodel, that he decided to make an entire Hodel AMA. And I meant to mention this one last week. The George Hodel monthly AMA came out about 2 weeks ago, but one thing that Larry Harnish said about not only George Hodel, but also Steve Hodel, author of the Most Evil series, where he accuses his father of being the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer. One thing that he said about them was that he goes easy on Steve Hodel. The Zodiac followers are way harsher, much harsher on Steve Hodel than anyone in the Black Dahlia world. They're much harsher on George Hodel as a Zodiac Killer suspect than people are as a Black Dahlia suspect. And I was really quite surprised to hear that, or I was quite surprised to hear it phrased in that exact way, because I'm not completely convinced that that's true. Mostly, I mean, actually, I can let you guys know like this. I might have been contacted by 3 people, maybe 4 people over the years in my comment section who are saying that they actually think that George Hodel was the Zodiac Killer. They're definitely out there. And there are also other people like Yves Persson, the school teacher from France, who claimed he deciphered a symbol on the Halloween card and that revealed George Hodel's name. But I really don't think that people who follow the Zodiac Killer mystery are extremely harsh on Steve Hodel, and they're also not extremely harsh on George Hodel as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Instead, he's not taken seriously. You can dispute that with me if you want in the comments section down below, but what they say is George Hodel is not taken seriously as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and I'm definitely mostly in that category. But the type of response that I get from people in the comments section is really just, what do you think about George Hodel? Alright, well, he doesn't seem like a likely Zodiac Killer suspect, but, like, what do you think about him? That's what I get. Dozens and dozens of times. Again, it's very, very few people actually think that he was the Zodiac, and the book is Most Evil Part 2 that discusses George Hill Hodel as a Zodiac Killer suspect. I mean, you're dealing with a guy that was like 61 years old, who maybe wasn't even in San Francisco at the time, but he was a 61-year-old medical doctor who showed almost no medical knowledge or understandings in any of the Zodiac crimes, and this is coming from somebody who committed a surgical murder, the murder of Elizabeth Short in 1947, allegedly, because this is the stuff that I get into on Dahlia Thursday. George Hodel was never convicted of the crime. He was under police suspicion and for 5 weeks. He was under police surveillance for 5 weeks, and they didn't find anything. And somebody else was asking, well, didn't he leave the country, like, right after the Black Dahlia murder? And it's my understanding, again, as a newcomer to the Black Dahlia case, but with this Zodiac suspect, George Hodel was accused of sexual assault by his daughter Tamar Hodel in 1949. Then, that actually really messed up his life, even though it's possible he might not even have done that, because Tamar Hodel was a wild storyteller. So what George Hodel actually did was, he went to Hawaii first, and then he ultimately went to the Philippines, and it seems like in 1967, he was living in the Philippines, and he started a new family. Larry Harnish even disputes the fact that he was in San Francisco at all in 1968. But that is one thing that I hadn't disputed too quickly, because Steve Hodel claimed he could prove it, and I didn't look too strongly into George Hodel as a suspect because of all of the counter evidence. The age, the mindset, the education. I mean, like, there's certainly no real indication to me in any of the Zodiac letters that they were written by a medical doctor, a specialist in venereal diseases. There's also no allusion to the Black Dahlia murder directly. I mean, you stumbled upon my Riverside activity, but there are a hell of a lot more down there. Whatever. I mean, that's not a direct allusion to the Black Dahlia murder, if it is the same killer. But then, George Hodel claims that, or they claim that George Hodel went to Hawaii because he was under surveillance and suspicion for the Black Dahlia crime. Yeah, that wouldn't help. I mean, because there are things like extradition, and you might be like, well, in 1949 and 1951, was Hawaii really a state? Doesn't matter. You can still extradite people from territories. I've talked about this before on Black Box Online Radio when I was reading the book Homicide, The View from Inside the Yellow Tape. And, Seattle Homicide could extradite people from Saipan and Micronesia. So yes, you can extradite somebody from somewhere else, and furthermore, there is no statute of limitations on murder. If they actually had the evidence to have convicted George Hodel, they could have extradited him for the Black Dahlia murder. Insufficient evidence for the Black Dahlia case, insufficient evidence for the Zodiac case. Now, with the Black Dahlia murder, I would absolutely listen way more closely and way more heavily to anything presented about him as a suspect. There are other suspects in the Black Dahlia case that are reasonable, but in terms of the Zodiac case, I think that George Hodel is a bottom-of-the-barrel suspect, and that's just it. He's not taken seriously. I don't think people are overly harsh and they're, just absolutely trying to trash-talk Steve Hodel and his Zodiac theory. I think that they're mostly dismissive of it. Let me know what you think. You can put your responses in the comments section down below, and I would love to read them. And right now, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. You can support this channel at buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. Batman bought you a coffee. I never get tired of saying that. Looking forward to another upcoming week of Black Box Online Radio, says Batman66, and I really do appreciate that. Thank you so much for helping out on buymeacoffee.com, and also, I hope everybody has a wonderful week. There are going to be a lot of new things happening on Black Box Online Radio over the coming weeks. Firstly, we are approaching the month of October. This episode is being recorded on September 29th. But in October, I will be celebrating Halloween on the channel, and the episode will probably come out during the second or third week of October. It will be an early Halloween party here on BBO War, but you can always stop in early. If you want to listen on Halloween, all of that is welcome. And some other things that are more relevant to the true crime news is that for the Tuesday show, I've been doing a segment about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann from Praia da Luz, Portugal, back in 2007. Maybe the most famous missing persons case in the world. And I'm going to do the final episode in that series on Tuesday, and there are a couple reasons for this. The biggest reason is, by chance, I had the opportunity to interview an individual named Tim Wallace, who is a follower of the Maura Murray case. And that was just supposed to be a one-off interview. It was about 1 hour and 40 minutes long. I uploaded it on the weekend as a bonus podcast. But you guys gave me so much homework. People are saying, hey, great interview, but what about all of these questions? I'm like, wow, I would love to respond to those. Some people said, hey, thanks for the interview, but I really think you need to check out this resource. And I'm like, thank you for that as well. And the Maura Murray case is one that I followed a little bit more intensely than Madeleine McCann, so it's difficult for me to walk away from that, and I'm going to do another limited series about the disappearance of Maura Murray from 2004, starting next Tuesday, here on Black Box Online Radio. Tomorrow will be the final episode on the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And also, in the future, I hope to get back to the case of Jean-Benet Ramsey, because I think that series is incomplete. And our next one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery. River Prawn Pottery as well. Thank you for your regular and consistent support. I really do appreciate it. And River Prawn Pottery did have a good request. Last week on the channel, I interviewed Mark Hewitt, who is the author of Hunted, Profiled, and Exposed, and his book Exposed looks at Ted Kaczynski as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And River Prawn Pottery had a request, and that is, sometimes when I do interviews here on Zodiac Monday, as well as on the other shows, I often ask the guests, what is your biggest piece of evidence in favor of this suspect being the Zodiac Killer? And I should do that more often. Okay, so I'm going to give you the response to that question at the end of the supporter shoutouts segments, but that is an excellent idea. Thank you, River Prawn Pottery. And our next one goes to CZ Guy. CZ Guy, another regular and consistent supporter. It wouldn't be complete without you three guys. Batman66, River Prawn Pottery, and CZ Guy. I thank you for everything. And we also have a supporter on buymeacoffee.com named Flora, who's becoming a regular and consistent supporter. And Flora says, "Thank you for your dedication and research to all the diverse cases." And Flora, thank you as well for contributing on buymeacoffee.com. And Flora is a close follower of Dahlia Thursday, all about the Black Dahlia murder, the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947. All right, though. I just told you guys that there was a question that has been proposed, or a challenge statement, rather, and that is about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And River Prom Pottery said, "I should have asked Mark Hewitt, what is your biggest piece of evidence in favor of Ted Kaczynski being the Zodiac Killer, the Unabomber Zodiac connection?" And I did not ask him that during the interview, so I sent it to Mark Hewitt as a follow-up, and he said that, that's a speculative statement, and the biggest piece of evidence or the strongest piece of evidence might mean different things to different people. And, of course, you guys might not find that to be very satisfying, so I'm going to give my response. What is the biggest piece of evidence in favor of Ted Kaczynski being both the Zodiac Killer and the Unabomber? And my response is that it's the Unabomber. It's the Unabomber. That's probably not the response that you wanted either. But what do I mean by that? Ted Kaczynski was a documented serial killer. Like, he was the Unabomber. I think he did it. Everybody thinks he did it. He was a real serial killer who committed crimes by mailing things in, whether it's not only the bombs, he also mailed in the manifesto. He provided explanations as to why he was committing his crimes. He had a clear grudge. He also designed his own symbol that's rather similar to that of the Zodiac Killer. So I think that there are elements in the construction of the Unabomber persona that show striking similarities to that of the Zodiac Killer. Now, here's something else, though, that people look at with Ted Kaczynski. The handwriting. I think some people might go as far as to say that Ted Kaczynski had the most similar handwriting to the Zodiac letters than any other suspect. But no, I don't personally think that. I've seen better examples of Zodiac Killer handwriting than Ted Kaczynski, and Kaczynski might even be on the neater side, like the Melvin Belli letter and Dragon Card letter style of writing. But what do you think? And also, what do you think about my statement? And I say that because so many people get accused of being the Zodiac Killer, so many individuals, and the whole pushback is, well, now, wait a second, did this person actually kill anyone? I mean, I know that, they were an unlikable individual, they did suspicious things, even like Arthur Lee Allen, who was an actual criminal, a sex offender. Well, did he actually murder anyone? Did he actually commit the Zodiac murders? I know he did bad things, but was he actually a serial killer who mailed in communications and told you why he was committing the crimes and had his own symbol and his own belief system? I don't know if that's true, not with Arthur Lee Allen or Richard Gaikowski or Lawrence Kane, but with Ted Kaczynski, all of those things are true. Let me know what you think about that statement, and please drop your responses in the comment section down below. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe to follow along with all of the episodes here on Black Box Online Radio. But I would like to do something a little bit different right now and talk about the book In the Shadow of Madness. It's really Zodiac Killer in the Shadow of Madness by Professor Heinrich Mueller. And in the Shadow of Madness, it seems like he may have taken certain flavors from Micro Deli's In the Shadow of Mount Diablo. This is a very short book. Really, it's like an e-booklet, perhaps. I think my copy is 24 pages long. A lot of it's some very general stuff. And the facts are okay in terms of their arrangement, although he did state that Cecilia Shepard was stabbed 11 times at Lake Berryessa and Brian Hartnell was stabbed 6 times. More famously, Cecilia Shepard was stabbed 5 times, 5 in the front, 5 in the back at Lake Berryessa. But in terms of maybe why he thought that, I was thinking Gareth Penn wrote the book Time 17, where he stated very clearly that Cecilia was stabbed 10 times and Brian 7 times, so that totals 17. Maybe Heinrich Mueller was trying to put things together. And also, Cecilia Shepard had additional lacerations on her body, like when the Zodiac is moving the knife up and down and like the knife went against her arm and such. Richard Grinnell did an excellent illustration of that over on ZodiacCyphers.com once. So I'm really trying to be as generous as I can, and I also don't want to nitpick, but that's something that just really stood out to me. However, I would also like to look at Professor Heinrich Mueller's book In the Shadow of Madness, and this is called The Course of the Crimes. The Zodiac Killer did not kill in haste. He selected his victims, his locations, and even his words with calculated precision. Overall, I think that that's true. That's a speculative statement. I mean, it's also a profiling-based statement. We don't know that 100%, but it does appear to me that that's most likely true if I had to make a determination right now. The Zodiac's crimes were not the result of spontaneous rage, but of a deliberate choreography. And the more I learn about the Zodiac Killer, the more I read about true crime, the more I'm on that side. Murder was the message. The following timeline of confirmed attacks reveals not only the escalating brutality of his acts, but also the growing theatricality of a man who wanted to be seen, feared, and remembered. Lake Herman Road was the first known Zodiac attack, and it was a double murder that came without warning. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were parked in a quiet area along Lake Herman Road, a popular spot for young couples. Around 11 p.m., a car pulled up and a man got out and approached their vehicle and fired without speaking a word. Yep, totally. I agree with that. David was shot behind the ear while still in the car. Oh, now wait a second. Now we have something very big here. How do we know that David Faraday was shot while sitting in the front seat of the car? Other people have talked about this. Dr. Todd Grande even included that in his vehicle, in his video, that David Faraday was in the vehicle when he was shot. I mean, David Faraday's body is outside of the car when he is found, and a lot of people think that David and Betty Lou exited by their own hand, for lack of a better term, that they weren't pulled out of the car by the Zodiac. That he either ordered them out, or they did it voluntarily. He told them to face the vehicle, face the road, then they were shot. And if I had to bet my life on that, I would say that that's what happened. Betty Lou tried to run, but was hit 5 times in the back by the time the police arrived. No fingerprints and no clear motive were established. And I think that this is one thing that a lot of newcomers to the case expect. I thought this. I absolutely thought this, like when I first started reading about the Zodiac Killer, that David Faraday was shot while sitting in the front seat of the car. Why? Because Mike Mageau was shot while sitting in the front seat of the car at Blue Rock Springs. And I did like what the Infographics channel thought. I thought Mike Mageau was in the driver's seat because David Faraday was in the driver's seat. But we have complete reversals. David Faraday is in the driver's seat at Lake Herman Road. Most likely, he was shot outside of the car, and why he exited, I think it's because Betty Lou told him to run, and they got out of the car, the Zodiac took control of the situation, and he shot them. And this is going to relate to something that's very important from Micro Deli's presentation on the Chronicle, and it's something that he's talked about before, but he contacted the profiler Richard Walter from the Vidocq Society, named for Eugene Francois Vidocq, who was the more or less father or godfather of modern-day criminology. And Richard Walter made an observation about the Zodiac case, and that is that the Zodiac is power assertive, and every time he used a gun or a knife to maintain control of the situation, when he walks up on the victims, he pulls out a gun or a knife to take control, and I will add an additional element to that. The Zodiac always took control with a gun. Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa, the Stein murder, he used the gun. He approaches Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa with the knife drawn. No, the knife wasn't drawn yet. He was using the gun, the .45 that I told you about. He is a power-assertive serial killer, and he uses the gun for mind power, and in 3 of the instances, he also used it to kill victims. So absolutely, the Zodiac is a power-assertive killer, and he's using the gun to maintain control of the situation. It's one of the few commonalities that we have. The other one that I've talked about so many times is that cars are nearby all the crime scenes, and also somebody brought this to my attention recently, that all of the crimes happen either in a park or in the vicinity of a park. So maybe it's just secluded areas, or maybe the Zodiac's attracted to wide open spaces, and it really could be something of a combination of the two. But I also have a statement that was shared on a different episode. On Wednesdays, I talk about Jack the Ripper here on Black Box Online Radio, Ripper Wednesday, and somebody left a comment about these profiling statements, because last week I was discussing a psychological profile of Jack the Ripper, and somebody said, wait a second, if we don't truly know how many victims the killer murdered, what use is a psychological profile? How is the profile going to be accurate? Would that not change the course of your profile? And for me, absolutely. Yes, that guy's right. He's completely right. Like, look at the Zodiac Killer, for example. Let's apply that to the Zodiac Killer mystery, where, let's say, we learn definitively that Sherry Jo Bates was a Zodiac Killer victim, who was stabbed multiple times in Riverside, California. What if we definitively learned that? Would that change my thoughts on the case? Yes. What if we learned that Ray Davis, the taxi driver who was murdered in 1962, was a definitive Zodiac Killer victim? Would that change my thoughts on the case? Yes. Would that change my thoughts about psychological profiling? Yes. So, until we know all of the victims that were actually killed by the killer, of what used as a psychological profile, same as it is now, it's an educated guess. But it's very, very difficult to get it right 100%. And I fully admit that it's not a perfect science, and there are kind of holes in people's areas, but at the same time, I'm not going to give up, and I do think it's a fascinating way of exploring the material. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. My stance is, it's not perfect, but it's one of the few things that we actually have. And right now, though, I would like to switch gears and conclude the episode with our Zodiac Monday movie. And this week's episode will conclude with He Walked by Night from 1948, excuse me. And this is one that was recommended to me a long time ago, actually. In 2023, I started doing the Zodiac Monday movie segment where I would talk about a film that is relevant to the Zodiac Killer mystery. And one of the recommendations that I recorded was a film called He Walked by Night that is available here on YouTube. However, I don't have it written down about the person who recommended this movie, otherwise I would give you a shout out. But I watched it on YouTube, and it's a, very, very interesting detective movie. It's a film from the 40s. It doesn't have a romantic side plot, and I'm not going to lie to you guys, my absolute favorite part of this movie was just reading through the comments section, just reading the comments of people who love watching old black and white movies, and they were saying that He Walked by Night was one of the inspirations for Dragnet, as well as just very influential on other film noir movies of that era. But it tells the story of a serial killer that is on the loose, and it starts out with a man who is sitting in a car, and then we learn that that man's a police officer, and then he eyes somebody who might be committing something suspicious, and he calls him over, says, hey, come here for a second, I want to ask you a few questions, and then he asks for an ID, and the man that walked over just pulls out a gun and shoots him. He walked by night, right? This man tries to escape in a vehicle, and then the car won't start, so he has to run, and what do they find in the vehicle? An arsenal of weapons. It's like a kill kit, but very specifically, the weapons. This is when I began to think of the Zodiac Killer. Is that how the Zodiac operated? Different guns hidden in the trunk of his car, pre-cut lengths of rope in the car when he needed them. Maybe he brings them inside at some point, but he has all of the weapons ready to go, seizing the day, an opportunistic serial killer. Then, yes, I do think the Zodiac was both opportunistic and calculated, and let's be very clear. You can do both. A murder can be planned, but the victims may not be pre-chosen. So this individual has just shot a cop, and he goes on the run. And then the first 5 minutes of the movie were very gripping. Then they had 20 minutes of kind of just a little bit spacey, where it's hard to focus. But the other things that really stood out to me in this movie, He Walked by Night, were that the killer is very consciously trying to change the way that he commits crimes so that the police can't figure out what he's going to do next. They can't predict his next move. And the reason why I'm telling you this here on Zodiac Monday is because we were talking about this exact same thing last week in the movie segment, which was While the City Sleeps. And that had a killer in a 1956 film who is intentionally changing the way he commits crimes so the police can't predict his next move. And While the City Sleeps may have been a real Zodiac inspiration because it's all about, oh, he only attacks by night. This time, maybe he'll attack in the daylight. The Zodiac committed crimes at night, then Lake Berryessa happens in the daylight. With He Walked by Night, I think all of that is present. It might not be a direct influence on the Zodiac, but it shows that these ideas were very prevalent in films during the 40s and 50s, when the Zodiac Killer should have been a child growing up in America, or whatever country he was from, maybe Norway, maybe Canada. People have speculated a lot, right? But in terms of the way that people are thinking, we just struggle with this question. Why are there so many differences in the Zodiac Killer's crimes? Like the Lake Berryessa stabbings committed by knife, and he's wearing the hooded costume. The murder of Paul Stine has no woman present. He murders a taxi driver. What if the entire foundation of this is just he watched a lot of movies, and this was a very common theme that was in film noir in the 1940s and 50s. He committed the crimes in different ways so the police could not predict his activities. It could be as simple as that. And, He Walked by Night does have some entertaining moments. It has some entertaining police chases, but there are a lot of very long gaps. And I actually think that it's really interesting that they made a movie to focus only on the detective work without the romantic angles, because sometimes those can be a little bit sappy. But thank you so much for listening to this episode of Zodiac Monday. I appreciate every one of you who post stuff in the comments section. I appreciate every one of you who has recommended movies for this segment. And I kid thee not, I do take this segment very seriously, because it really shows that the Zodiac could have been borrowing ideas from contemporary film and incorporating them into the Zodiac persona. And in that context, everything's so much simpler. It's not this grand calculated conspiracy. No, he got the idea from a movie. This is how a villain is sneaky. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I've asked you loads of challenge questions. Please subscribe to the YouTube channels that I mentioned. Please look out for a new episode of the Chronicle, as well as the new interview series on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. And please just check out any of the sources that I mentioned. There's also a lot of great stuff on New Cokes, run by Vincent McConnell. There's a new episode of the Zodcast with Drew Beeson, and he's talking about other subjects like the Bayou murders and the yogurt shop killer who's been identified. Lots of stuff on YouTube in the true crime world. And that will be all for me now. This show comes to you Monday through Friday here on YouTube. On Mondays, I talk about the Zodiac Killer. I'm going to do the new Maura Murray segment coming out soon, as well as Ripper Wednesday about Jack the Ripper, Dahlia Thursday about the Black Dahlia, and Cooper Friday about D.B. Cooper. And the show also comes out in short form Monday through Friday as well on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. My Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and my YouTube name is blackboxonlineradio. I meant to say Instagram. My Instagram name is blackboxned88. You already know about the buymeacoffee.com page. And you guys can also get the images for this program, which are archived at True Crime Designs on Facebook, True Crime Designs. And you can also download this show as a pure podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, anywhere you get your podcasts, under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And I'll see you tomorrow for an episode about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Goodbye.